I want to thank His Holiness for his commitment to this issue. And we're going to start, in partnership with His Holiness, 150 new waterkeepers across Asia, in the water. Over the next 2 years, based in his monasteries, which are mainly on rivers across Asia and the Himalayas, and it's really the waterway for almost 4 billion people. If we screw up how we manage those headwaters, you kill a lot of people, and you do a lot of other bad things to the planet. And one of the things that I was talking with, I had a long time this afternoon to talk with His Holiness. We spent most of the time laughing, but also talking about serious issues and the importance of protecting our waterways, and also how the battle, that this is an apocalyptical battle that we're engaged in now. It has to be a spiritual battle, because our destruction of our resources is driven by biological impulses that are implanted, that are hardwired in us, of greed and of narcissism, of selfishness, of the need to accumulate wealth at the expense of our fellows, of giving into the seduction of the notion that we can only advance ourselves as an individual by leaving our poor brothers and sisters behind, and that we can somehow afford to have this kind of lack of concern and the lack of concern with the consequences of our behavior that seems to be enjoyed by the 1%. And we talk about this, people who believe that they can insulate themselves from the consequences of their sins with private planes that jet them off to areas that they haven't polluted, or by living in neighborhoods that are guarded by security, and that somehow are going to protect them from the ravages of global warming and pollution and mercury contamination that they have released upon the rest of us. And we have to be examples, and we have to continue. One of the things we talk about is that never in history has anybody relinquished power or money without a demand, without force. And His Holiness said, we understand that, and we want to be part of the forceful resolution that you can't have peace on this planet if you don't have justice. And justice begins with the demand to share power and to share control over our waterways. And what the impulse that is driving these wealthy polluters is the impulse to privatize the commons, to steal something that belongs to the rest of us, the air, the water, the wildlife, the fisheries, the public lands, and turn those into private wealth for themselves, and then insulate themselves with various fortresses and walls and fortify their lives so that they don't have to see those consequences, that they don't have to think about them, and that they can escape from them. And what we have to do is remind them that we're all together, we're part of one planet, and that it's a spiritual solution, and that pollution this is a moral issue. Pollution is sin. And you can find mandates for that in the books and the traditions of every religious tradition throughout the history of mankind, that pollution is sin, that we're stewards, that God is not giving us this land, that He is putting us in charge of it for a generation of our lives. As stewards, that we can live off the interest, but we can't go into the capital. That belongs to our children. And our job is to act as trustees for those generations. And when bad people come and start going into the capital, we need to call them on it, and we need to call them on it forcefully. And this has always been a religious tradition, and it's not an accident that in every major religious tradition in the history of mankind, the central epiphany always occurs in the wilderness. Buddha had to go into the wilderness, Siddhartha, when he was a young prince, in order to sit under the Bodhi tree and have his first experience with transcendence. Muhammad had to go into the wilderness of Mount Hera in 609 and wrestle on a camping trip with his family, and wrestle the angel Gabriel in a cave, and where Gabriel got him in a bear hug and squeezed the first surahs of the Quran out of his body. All of the Talmudic and the ancient prophets, every one of them without exception, came out of the wilderness, because that's where they could commune with God, in the undiluted work of the Creator. Moses had to go to Mount Sinai for 40 days alone in order to see God, to see the face of God, and to hear his voice, and to retrieve the commandments. The Jews had spent 40 years wandering the desert wilderness in order to purge themselves of 400 years of slavery in Egypt. Christ had to go into the wilderness for 40 days alone to realize and recognize his divinity for the first time in his life. His mentor was John the Baptist, who was a man of the wilderness. And all of Christ's parables were taken from nature. I am the vine, you are the branches, the mustard seed, the little swallows, the scattering of the seeds on the fallow ground, the lilies of the field. He called himself a fisherman, a farmer, a vineyard keeper, a shepherd. The reason he did those things was because he understood that is where God talks to us most forcefully, through nature and through creation. And and it's not just a theme in religion, it's also a theme in democracy, which is the other target of these big polluters like the Koch brothers. They want to destroy our democracy, and our democracy is rooted in the confluence of nature and the environment. There was a time in our nation's history, right after the Revolutionary War, when Americans were suddenly wondering who we were, because we had been Europeans, we were British citizens, but all of a sudden we said, we're not European anymore. Well, what does it mean to be American? And the people who answered that question were our great artists and poets, and our writers like Emerson and Thoreau and James Fenimore Cooper and Melville and Hawthorne, who wrote these great books, these novels, which showed America how our personalities, how our values, our virtues, our attitudes, our characters of people were going to come out of the wilderness and out of nature. The philosopher school, Emerson and Thoreau, up in the Adirondacks, where they said, if you're an American and you want to hear the voice of God, you've got to go into the forest and listen to the songs of the birds and the rustle of leaves. And if you want to see the American soul, you have to look into the mirror of Walden Pond. And our great artists all came along at the same time. Thomas Cole, Frederick Church, Samuel F.B. Morse, Bierstein, Cropsey, what we call the Hudson River School, who painted these vast, indomitable landscapes where any evidence of humanity was kind of ant-like and ruins. And what they were saying is that, this is what makes us unique. You don't have to be ashamed if you don't have the 1,500 years of culture that they have in Europe, because you have this relationship with the land, and particularly wilderness. And that's going to be the source of your values and your virtues and your character as a people. And what we do is we work on wilderness. The rivers are the last wilderness left. They're still the wild places, even when they roll through a city, which is so important. That we had a national parks movement, a city parks movement very early at the same time in our history with Andrew Jackson David, Frederick Law Olmsted, who created these urban parks, the first in the world, because they said, this is where American values come from. Frederick Jackson Turner, our greatest American historian, said, in America, democracy came out of the forest. Without these vast tracts of wilderness and woodland, we wouldn't have evolved the political institutions in the form in which they did evolve. So it's really important that as the city, as America urbanizes, that all the people, poor and rich, have an opportunity to enjoy wilderness, even if it's in their backyards. They created Hyde Park and Central Park and cultivated these rivers that flow through our cities, which are, for many people, the only source of wilderness. But all of us need to go back to wilderness, and all of you guys know this. You know what happens to you when you're alone on that river, or when you're camping next to a campfire, and we're back in touch again with the 10,000 generations of human beings that were here before there were laptops, and we're in touch with something spiritual. And all of you know that happens. We go there because we get renewed. And we need to offer that opportunity to the poorest people in our communities. And that's why, my life, I started cleaning up the Hudson River, because it was an urban waterway. There's only one of the 5 boroughs of New York that are even connected to the mainland of the United States. The rest of them are islands in the Hudson. It's a maritime city. But we had lost touch with our waterways, and people lost touch with their history and the context of their communities and their values and all these other things. And now we're restoring that, and people are back on the river, and there's marinas and water skiers, and and people understand now that this is the greatest asset to the city. And all of these big cities that have plotted successfully the rebirth and renewal of their cities, they've all started with their waterfronts, whether it's Baltimore or Boston or San Antonio or San Francisco. The first thing they do, invest in that waterfront, get people back on the water, and the wealth spreads from there. When I started working on the Hudson River, the city of Irvington and Newburgh, the lowest value properties in those cities were the ones that were close to the water, because it stank and it was dangerous, and people didn't want anything to do with it. Today, those are the highest value properties, and they're creating tax revenue for those cities, as well as restoring their quality of life and their community character and making people proud to be members of that city. So that's where you put the investment, and reinvesting into your waterfront. And but all of this came out of this democratic impulse. And the Earth Day, I remember what it was like before Earth Day 1970. I remember the Cuyahoga River burning with flames that were 8 stories high that they couldn't put out for a week. I remember when they declared Lake Erie dead, 0 dissolved oxygen. I remember that I couldn't swim in the Hudson or the Charles or the Potomac when I was growing up. There were thousands of people who died every year from smog events in our cities. These young, smart, right-wing Tea Party guys up on Capitol Hill, they don't remember that. They don't see the benefits that we've gotten through our investment in our environmental infrastructure. All they see the cost to their donors, the Koch brothers, and the big polluters of complying with our environmental laws. And I remember when the Eastern Anatomy, I remember that the oil spill in Santa Barbara that cost $1 billion to Southern California communities in 1969 because it blackened the beaches, shut down surfing and everything else. And I remember, personally, when the Eastern and Adams peregrine falcons, because you guys know I was a falconer, I've trained hawks my whole life, and I watched this bird whenever I visited my uncle at the White House and my father at the Justice Department. It was the most spectacular predatory bird in North America, and they were nesting on the post office for generations on Pennsylvania Avenue. I could watch them fly off the cupola of the post office and come down Pennsylvania Avenue at 240 miles an hour, 40 feet above the heads of the pedestrians, pick pigeons out of the air and fly back to the cupola of the post office. And to me, seeing that sight was much more exciting than visiting my uncle in the White House. But that's a sight my children will never see, because that bird went extinct in 1963 from DDT poisoning, the same year that my uncle was killed. And then what happened? This woman from Pittsburgh, this very, very brilliant oceanographer, she was an oceanographer, but she didn't see the ocean until she was 22 years old. And her name was Rachel Carson. And she wrote a book about how the commons had been stolen from the American public and how we were getting screwed in the deal. And she was attacked by Hill and Knowlton, and by this vicious. They called her a spinster, which was the modern euphemism for lesbian, because that was completely destructive of her. She never defended herself. She was denounced by Time magazine, by Life magazine, by the New York Times, by the American Garden Society, by the American Medical Association. It was an all-front attack on this woman who stood up for science, because she read the science. And I'm very proud that my uncle, and the USDA, which was working for my Uncle John Kennedy, which was the worst of them all, and of course the Farm Bureau, which are just a bunch of barbarians working for Monsanto. I'm very proud that my Uncle John Kennedy stepped in and appointed a commission to read Silent Spring and to evaluate every relevant fact in that book, and which she had three citations for every fact that she cited. She knew she was going to be attacked. She was dying of cancer at the time and did not rise to defend herself. But my Uncle Jack appointed this commission, and they verified everything she said in that book, and it validated what she was doing. And that act started the snowball rolling. And that snowballed with all of these insults, you know, the Santa Barbara oil spill, the death of Lake Erie, this accumulation of insults which occurred in the late 60s, finally blossomed in a public democratic movement, this extraordinary spasm of democracy with 20 million Americans, 10% of our population on Earth Day 1970, came out onto the street demanding that angry and demanding that our political leadership return to the American people the ancient environmental rights that had been stolen from our citizens over the previous 80 years, because these rights used to exist. You know, they've always been the Magna Carta, the Code of Justinian, the Commons, the public trust doctrine that always existed, but it was eroded in this country after 1847. I'll tell you something, and this is a digression, but this whole talk has turned into a digression. It was in 1847, the rule in every jurisdiction in the United States that you had a factory and smoke from your factory got onto my land, your neighbor's land, one day a year, I had an absolute right to shut down your factory. That was the law, okay? Because it was a property, it was a trespass. You were interfering, the law is, property rights is, you can use your property as you see fit, but you cannot use it in a way that will diminish the use and enjoyment of your neighbor's property or of the public commons. And the judge at the time, there was no damages remedy at that time. There was only equitable remedy, and the judge had no choice but to shut down that factory. But then all of these different remedies were created that put the power into the hands of wealth. And you know, after Earth Day 1970, it frightened the bad guys. And it frightened the Democrats and Republicans, and over the next 10 years, they got together and they created all these laws that you and I use to defend the commons. The Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, RCRA, CERCLA, FIFRA, TSCRA, the Safe Drinking Water Act, and the Mining Acts, and all these other acts, 28 laws, and Richard Nixon, who was then president, created EPA and signed most of these laws into effect. And the polluting industry was caught off guard. They were dumbfounded by this. And then Lewis Powell wrote his famous memo, and they started putting these idiots on the Supreme Court. And you know, the Koch brothers got busy, and Paul Weyrich, and they created all of these. They regrouped and they attacked, and they began cutting away the laws that we use, and they created all of these phony think tanks, the Cato Institute, the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, the Marshall Institute, the Competitive Enterprise Institute, the American Enterprise Institute, and on again, and they pretend that they're free market institute. But they don't have anything to do with the free market. They hate free market capitalism. What they want is a ruthless, merciless, savage capitalism for the poor and socialism for the rich. That's what they do. And that's what they create. That's what they create. And it's a system that the Koch brothers, etc., have created in this country, which has now taken bloom. And you know what? When I spent a lot of the time growing up in Latin America, and I saw what happened when you have a polarized society with people who are rich dominating the society, and then a huge gap, and the rest of everybody is poor. Here's what happens to democracy. One political party becomes the party of the rich, and their job is to protect the political perks and the power of the rich people, and then the other party becomes the party of the poor, and they're always weaker, and they have less money, and they're scattered. But the party of the rich is very focused. But you know what? Corporate profit-taking and big accumulations of money is a very, very weak vessel for populism. So they have the money, but they can't get the people. So the way that they get the people is by lying, by making it hard to vote or participate in democracy, and then by drumming up this imperialistic furor, nationalistic furor, by getting people to think we have to behave, we have to fall in line because there's somebody outside who's going to get us. It could be somebody inside, it could be the gays, it could be the immigrants, it could be the blacks, it could be the Puerto Ricans, or it could be somebody outside, you know, a terrorist or whatever, and they do that in order to consolidate their own power, and it's a very, very effective way to do that. But, you know, the Koch brothers, you know, were the poster child for all of this stuff. They created ALEX, the American Legislative Exchange Council, and Federalist Society, and all these other ones, and funded. And Alex is right, and you know, they weren't worried about wind and solar for a long time. But for the past 3 years, wind and solar, even with gas, frac gas, at $2 per 1,000 cubic feet, wind and solar is still killing them in the marketplace. We have built more wind generation and more solar generation in every one of the last 3 years than all of the incumbents combined. We built in this quarter 1.3 megawatts, a gigawatt, 1.3 gigawatts of solar power. It's the most, it's 79% up from last year, and it's the individuals. And when the individuals do that, it democratizes our society. When you have a society that, when the political organization of the society tends to resemble and reflect its economic organization. So if you have an economic organization that's controlled by a few big shots, the Koch brothers who own the oil fields, the Blanketships who own the coal fields, the Exxons who have their oil fields, and it's a few guys, well, guess what? Your political system is going to start to look like an oligarchy, and then it is going to decline into a corporate kleptocracy, which is exactly what they want. So, and that's what's happening. But if you have a society where thousands of people control their own solar energy, and it's on their rooftops, it democratizes our society. And it makes a strong democracy, and it's a more resilient system. It's easy for a terrorist to blow up a power plant. It's really hard for them to blow up 1 million homes. So it makes us more powerful, it makes us stronger, and it democratizes us. And and it's the same thing, Thomas Jefferson used to say that American democracy could only survive if there was a broad distribution of land ownership. Because he said, we have to keep the land in the hands of tens of thousands of independent yeoman farmers, each with a stake in our system of government. And, you know, what we've seen in North Carolina with the CAFOs is that 85% of the land base is now controlled by one big company that happens to now be a Chinese company, you know, who either has contracts or direct ownership of the land. We have, and all over the world, if you see, you know, everywhere where you see civic unrest, where you see riots in the world, it always happens where people don't own the land. You know, during the riots of the 60s, it happened in the cities because they were renters. But in the countryside and suburbs, there were no riots. Today, the reason we're seeing these revolution in Syria, it's a global warming revolution. You know, they gave away the water rights to a few big companies in the southern part of Syria, and then they had a drought, massive drought from global warming. You had 10 million farmers whose crop failed, 3 million had to leave their land, and they poured into the cities, and that's why we have a revolution. That's where all of the Arab Spring came from global warming and from people being dispelled from their land. It doesn't happen where you own your land, and it doesn't happen where you own your land and you own the energy supply. We have a very, very strong democracy. That's what we're fighting for, a strong democracy. And we know how that's, and any time you see environmental injury, like whether you're in West Virginia or whether you're in the CAFOs, you will also see the subversion of democracy. You will see the capture of the agencies that are supposed to be protecting us from pollution. The DEP, the DEC, the local EPAs, they become the sock puppet for the industries that they're supposed to regulate. You will see the corruption of public officials and our elected officials. In the state of West Virginia, poll after poll shows that 85% of the people in the state believe that mountaintop removal mining should end immediately, but not a single politician in the state will say that out loud. Why? Because of corruption. You'll see the disappearance of transparency in government. You'll see the disappearance of local democracy, eradication of zoning laws and planning laws. If you live in one of the hollows of West Virginia, you can't zone out mountaintop removal mining. You have no power over the land, the town about which you're supposed to be sovereign. If you live in Iowa, you can't zone out a CAFO that's going to move next door to you. So they steal our democracy and then they lie to us. And you know, they lie to us, and I gotta say this because, and I'm gonna shut up in a second, but let me say this. These guys who claim that they love, you know, democracy and that they're strict constructionists, etc. Well, here's the truth. In 13 states, it is now illegal against the law to criticize factory farm food. Now you say, now he's lying. Okay, that couldn't be true. We have a First Amendment in this country. But ask Oprah Winfrey, because she had to go down to trial in the state of Texas because she had a cowboy, mad cowboy, on her show in New York State that was shown in Texas and in New York City, and he said that, you know, that factory farm food is loaded with hormones and antibiotics, and they got sued in Texas. She had to go down there for 3 weeks for a jury trial in the state of Texas. So there are 13 states that have veggie libel laws. There are 3 states that have passed laws that make it illegal for you to take a picture of a factory farm from a public road, and a school teacher in Illinois 2 years ago was arrested and convicted for it. She didn't have the money to go to the Supreme Court and you know, defend another First Amendment. This week, the Republicans in the state of North Carolina put forward a law, offered a law that makes it illegal for anybody, any citizen of the state of North Carolina to disclose the constituents of fracking chemical that are used anywhere in the country, and they don't even have fracking in North Carolina, right? This is why, you know, well, yeah, you're trying to. But, you know, I don't want to use the word prostitutes, but I'm going to use it. This week, yesterday, the United States, the Republicans in the United States Senate passed a law making it illegal for the Pentagon to talk about global warming. And during the Bush administration, the Republicans in Congress made it illegal for EPA to study global warming. So these are the guys who are saying, well, you know, we are strict constitutional constructionists and we believe in the Bill of Rights and Obama is a dictator and is trying. Well, where are they today? This is, you know, this is the Bill of Rights. This is called the First Amendment. These are the people, you know, and by the way, they're not against the First Amendment. And you know what I'm talking about. They have expanded the First Amendment when it comes to defending corporations. They've said corporations are citizens and speech is money. So they love corporations when it comes to corporation. They love the First Amendment and the Constitution when it comes to corporations, but they don't like it when it comes to the rest of us. And, you know, we are, you know, and these are the battles that we're fighting now. And they're, you know, they're battles about our democracy and what kind of world that our children are going to live in. And, you know, is it going to be a world where we have democracy and they participate in the sovereignty over their day-to-day rights, or are we going to live in a country that is run by a corporate kleptocracy? And you know, from the beginning of our national history, our greatest political, you hear from the Tea Party all the time, and I promise I'm winding down. You know, you hear from the Tea Party that we have to worry about big government and its impacts on our democracy. And I agree with that, 100%. Big government is a huge threat to democracy. When big government is reading our mail, when they're flying drones over and killing people without due process, when they are suspending habeas corpus, when they're locking people in jail for life without attorneys or representation, when they're, you know, listening to our phone calls and all this kind of, big government is very, very dangerous. But that's not what the Tea Party is worried about. They just don't want to pay their taxes. And by the way, they also, I'm going to say this, they also don't like having a black guy running the country. And anybody, you know, and you can give them the benefit of doubt on that, but anybody who was surprised by what Clive Bundy said a couple of weeks ago has not been paying attention to the Tea Party. You know, this is all about a sentiment for the plantation economy, for going back to the good old days that were good for some people but bad for most of them. And that's what it's about, and that's what this Tea Party is about. They should be on our side, because we're fighting. But I'll tell you, and I got distracted, and I'm sorry. Here's what the Tea Party should be talking about. They should be talking about not the danger of big government, which is important, but the danger of excessive corporate power. And from the beginning of our nation's history, the greatest leaders, Republicans and Democrats, in our history have warned Americans against the domination by corporate power. Teddy Roosevelt said that America would never be destroyed by a foreign enemy like Osama bin Laden. But he warned that our beloved political institutions would be subverted by malefactors of great wealth who would steal them from within. Dwight Eisenhower, a Republican, in his most famous speech ever, warned Americans against the domination by the military-industrial complex, with which he included in the first draft of his speech the oil industry. Abraham Lincoln, the greatest Republican in history, founder of the Republican Party, said in 1863, "I have the South in front of me, and I have the bankers behind me. And for my nation, I fear the bankers more." And Franklin Roosevelt, in 1943, said, at the height of World War II, said that the domination of government by corporate power is, quote, "the essence of fascism." And Benito Mussolini, who had an insider's view of that process, echoed that pronouncement. He said he complained that fascism should not be called fascism, it should be called corporatism, because it was the merger of state and corporate power. And what we have to understand as Americans is that the domination of business by government is called communism. The domination of government by business is called fascism. And what we have to do is walk that narrow trail in between, which is free market capitalism and democracy, and keep big government at bay with our left hand and big business at bay with our right. And to do that, we need an active, independent, and fearless press that is willing to get up and speak truth to power, which we don't have anymore in this country. We need a public that understands, an educated, informed public that understands all the milestones of tyranny and is able to fight them and willing to fight them step by step, all the way back, starting with the intrusions, the privacy of the commons that happens on our rivers and streams. And I remember back in 1989 when the walls were coming down and all of us were excited in Eastern Europe and, you know, in China and Russia and Poland and Czechoslovakia, and all of a sudden we were going to get a peace dividend after 50 years of Cold War and digging the fallout shelters and making bombers and everything. Finally, we were going to get a peace dividend. But we never got that peace dividend, did we? And we were going to spend that on the environment, and on education, and all these other things that to make our country the shining jewel that it was supposed to be, the exemplary nation that it was supposed to be to the rest of the world. But we never got that peace dividend. Why is that? Because capitalism, after it defeated communism, turned on us and began to devour democracy. And you go to China, where Deng Xiaoping made the decision, yes, we're going to have economic freedom. No, we're not going to have political freedom. And now Putin has done the same thing in Russia. And all over the world, the same thing has happened. Politicians have all of a sudden realized you can have economic freedom without having political freedom. And that is where our fight is going to be over the next 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. We need to start on the rivers, but we also need to understand the connection that these battles have to all of the issues that we care about. And you know, many of the people who care about these things are gone now. The unions are gone in this country, and you know, many of the others. But what they don't know that they have to contend with is you people, you know, who are not going to give up, who are going to stay knee-deep in your waders, in your waterway, and you're going to say to the people in your community, this waterway belongs to you. Every people, every child, whether they're black or white, young or old, humble or noble, rich or poor, who lives in Pittsburgh has a right to go down to the Monongahela, to the Allegheny, the Ohio with a fishing rod, throw in a plug, and bring out a catfish, and bring it home and feed it to their family with pride, and with the assurance that they're not going to poison somebody. And that's a right that we have as Americans. That's a right that Chinese have, that the Indians have, that the Africans have, the Nepalese, the Tibetans, everybody in the world. And we are the ones who are going to have to carry that message. The burden is on us to carry that message to every corner of the globe and to fight back and not let them take the great social safety net, the foundation, the cauldron of democracy that is represented by wilderness and waterways in our cities. I want to tell all of you that I am going to be here fighting for this until I have to die with my boots on. And I will stand side by side with every one of you in this battle. See you on the barricade. Thank you.